You're watching a Highwire Media podcast.
Hello, true crime lovers, and welcome to Murder Monday. Today, we're diving into the preppy murder. The murder and rape of 18-year-old Jennifer Levin. Before we do that, let me know your thoughts on this case in the comment section below. Let's have a conversation. And with that, let's dive into today's episode. So you have to admit, there is nothing like young love. Being a teenager, having a crush on someone, it makes you feel like anything is possible. Your heart has never been broken, so you just jump off. You go in full force. When that person reciprocates, it feels like almost invincible. And this was the high that 18-year-old Jennifer Levin was riding back when she met the handsome, charming 19-year-old Robert Chambers in 1986. What she never could have anticipated, though, was that summer crush would cost her her life. For today's case, I want to go back to the year 1986. This is where our story begins. Imagine you're passing a newsstand or catching a glimpse of the 7 o'clock news. Some of the headlines you'll see: the Space Shuttle Challenger explodes just a minute after takeoff. A mishandled safety test at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant leads to disaster. A Pan Am flight carrying 394 passengers has been hijacked, heading for the U.S. So a pretty big, yet grim year. And amongst all the glitz and glamour of the Big Apple, things are just looking as bleak. Crime is getting worse in New York City, rising 8% that year. All eyes are on the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, who's cracking down hard on organized crime. But no one is expecting a threat to come from a wealthy 19-year-old living in the Upper East Side, and Jennifer Levin, the girl in our story, certainly isn't. The 18-year-old Jennifer was born in Long Island, New York, but in the last few years, she moved to the blossoming artsy neighborhood of Soho, with her father a prominent real estate agent. So Jennifer attended the Baldwin School, which was a prestigious all-girls school in the Chelsea neighborhood of Manhattan. And to say Jennifer was popular there would have been an understatement. She had dozens of friends and plenty of admirers. She was bubbly, outgoing, even voted best looking in her graduating class. But by the spring of 1986, Jennifer was ready to get out of New York City and start her next chapter, Chamberlain Junior College in Boston in the fall. In the meantime, though, she and her friends had been spending their nights drinking and recounting old memories at a place called Dorian's Red Hand Bar, just a few blocks from Central Park on the Upper East Side. And if you are keeping track, yes, she's not of drinking age. But I think if you watched Gossip Girl, it's safe to say that most Upper East Side kids aren't of drinking age and are still drinking. So Dorian's was a cozy, old-fashioned little spot that on cold nights always had wood burning in the fireplace, but it was sophisticated. Girls came in with their best mink coats, men in their khakis and button-downs. It was a place to see and be seen, particularly if you were young, beautiful, and wealthy. So over the course of 1986, Jennifer and her friends became regulars at Dorian's, getting to know many of the other people who came and went from the place. Then one evening, Jennifer spotted a young man sitting at the bar, a guy she hadn't seen at Dorian's before. She asked her friend, "Who's that?" His name was Robert, but Jennifer's friend sort of warns her about the guy. I guess people are always gossiping about him. Apparently he'd stolen money from some friends, broken into people's apartments, gotten mixed up with drugs. But to Jennifer, that made him somewhat more appealing. Seriously. If it were true, it meant he was a bad boy, and so she wanted to know more. His full name was Robert Emmett Chambers, and he was 19 years old, so just a year older than her. He was 6'5", about 220 pounds of muscle with piercing blue eyes. Like Jennifer, Robert had attended fancy prep schools throughout the city, but unlike Jennifer, most of his schooling was paid for by scholarships, since his mother couldn't quite afford to pay his tuition on a nurse's salary. His mother, an immigrant from Ireland, worked hard to give Robert the life that she'd always dreamed of. What little cash she had, she spent on nice clothes for him, so he could feel like he fit in at school. But Robert felt he needed more than clothes to play the part. Oftentimes he felt like he didn't belong at those prep schools. He thought he stood out like a sore thumb. As a result, many found him to be sort of antisocial. However, Robert's mother knew how to climb the ranks of New York's elite, and over time, she worked her way into some of the city's wealthiest families. Working as a private nurse for people like John F. Kennedy Jr., and the Hearst family, the newspaper mogul. Eventually, this afforded her and Robert the lifestyle she always wanted. They moved from Queens to Brownstone on 90th Street on the Upper East Side, but this didn't help solve Robert's problems. If anything, some of his bad habits became worse over time. By the time he was 13, he was sneaking into bars, drinking steadily, and using marijuana heavily. Robert was often invited to parties and seen fraternizing with girls who flocked to his handsome good looks and charm. When he couldn't weasel his way into public watering holes, Robert found a few secret corners at Central Park to sneak drinks and do cocaine. By the time he left for his freshman year at Boston University, Robert had been accused of stealing credit cards from a friend and a teacher, as well as a few other instances of petty theft. Perhaps not surprisingly, Robert only lasted one semester at Boston University. He was caught with marijuana in his dorm room, and this time he had stolen his roommate's credit card. So by the spring of 1986, Robert was back home with his parents, and that bad boy reputation Jennifer was hearing about seemed to be pretty true. She just didn't know the full extent of it yet. In May 1986, Jennifer received her diploma, and on the night of her graduation, she and a few friends went out to celebrate. And of course, their destination of choice was Dorian's. Ever since Jennifer had laid eyes on Robert, she hadn't been able to get him out of her mind. Part of her hoped, or rather expected, to see him at Dorian's that evening, and she got lucky. She and her friend Betsy spotted him sitting at a table almost right away. This time, Betsy, who happened to know Robert, took a seat next to him, while Jennifer played it cool at the bar. When Betsy returned, she had some good news for Jennifer. Robert had told her that Jennifer was one of the best-looking girls he'd ever seen. He wanted to get to know her more, but not inside the bar. He had other girlfriends there who would get jealous if they saw him chatting. Could she meet him outside in 20 minutes so they could talk in private? And Jennifer was elated. By the time she came back from her first conversation with Robert, she was glowing. Just a few days later, they went on a date and had sex for the first time. At first, Jennifer worried it was just going to be like a one-night stand, but after going to Boston for her college orientation in July, she returned home to a slew of voicemails from Robert begging her to call him back. The two met up again for another date before Jennifer went on a trip to LA a few weeks later. But while Jennifer was away, Robert didn't hold out for her. He kept seeing other women. He was even spotted in Central Park with a beautiful new 16-year-old blonde, also from the Upper East Side. When Jennifer returned to the city on August 25th, she hadn't heard much from Robert. But she knew where she could find him, so she and her friends made a point to stop by Dorian's around midnight. And this is August 26th. The bar was packed that evening when Jennifer scanned the room for Robert after wading through the crowd of familiar faces. Jennifer made her way to the back and closed porch area. That's when she spotted him, those piercing blue eyes, the charming smile, sitting with a group of people that Jennifer didn't know. Rather than approach Robert directly, Jennifer sat down and introduced herself to the others at the table, talking about her trip to Los Angeles. Meanwhile, Robert acted cold, as if he didn't know her. As she talked, he just scowled and made faces at her from across the table. Jennifer could tell something was off with Robert, and after a few moments, she left him and his friends to continue the conversation without her. But about an hour later, Jennifer spotted Robert standing near the back bar alone. She figured this was her opportunity to confront him about his childish behavior, why he hadn't called her, and why he pretended he didn't know her. Excuse me. As they were chatting, Robert's new girlfriend, the young 16-year-old blonde, walked over and interrupted their conversation. Then she threw a bag full of condoms at Robert and yelled, "You can use these with someone else." Jennifer couldn't help but laugh at the awkwardness of the situation. Clearly, Robert had been playing them both, but he'd been caught in the act. And now half the bar was watching. Robert was visibly embarrassed and angry, particularly at Jennifer for laughing along with everyone. So he turned a cold shoulder and didn't speak to her for much of the night. By 2:30 a.m., some of Jennifer's friends were ready to head out, but Robert was still at the bar, and Jennifer felt there was still time to clear the air between the two of them. She wanted answers about their status, one way or the other. She deserved them. By about 4 a.m., the bar was emptying out and getting ready to close. Finally, Robert approached Jennifer and asked if she'd been interested in leaving with him. Jennifer knew she should stay strong, that she should tell him no after the way that he treated her all evening. especially after knowing that he'd been two-timing her over the last couple of weeks. But she had a crush, a big one, and she only had a few more days left in New York before she'd be leaving for Boston for college, which meant only a few more days to spend with Robert. Against her better judgment, Jennifer said yes. She threw her jean jacket over her shoulder and flipped her hair as Robert opened the door for her to leave. She hadn't called. She hears through the grapevine he's been running around with a blonde. She goes to the bar like there's a confrontation. Like, okay. So over New York City Central Park, the sun was starting to rise the next morning. Around 6:15 a.m., a female cyclist riding behind the Metropolitan Museum of Art spotted something under the trees. It looked like a woman, possibly asleep, but something gave the cyclist a pit in her stomach, a feeling that she needed to get a closer look just to be sure. She got off her bike and moved towards the body. When she was about 40 feet away, her fears were confirmed. This wasn't an unhoused New Yorker snoozing in the grass. It was a young woman, naked aside from the clothes that had been bunched up along her neck and waist. All right, the woman ran back to her bicycle, hopped back on, and rushed to a payphone to call the New York Police Department. By 6:21 a.m., the radios of two police officers went off with the phrase, "Woman down at 81st and East Drive." Sergeant Anthony McCullough was one of the first to arrive at the crime scene. He approached the body, wondering if he could maybe still help her. Her neck was covered in blood-red bruises, as though she had been strangled. But McCullough checked her pulse anyways. There was nothing. The more McCullough examined the woman, the more he noticed it wasn't just her neck. Her entire face and body appeared to be covered in bruises, as well as cuts and bite marks. One of her eyes was swollen. She was laid out spread eagle in the grass. Her bra pushed up around her neck, her skirt was around her waist, and her underwear was missing. All of her private areas were exposed. McCullough's gut reaction was this wasn't just a murder, it was also a rape. Meanwhile, a crowd had already begun to gather, which is so heartbreaking. Like, no one should have to see you. No one should see a victim in that scenario. Some people would say they probably wouldn't stop, but then I think you kind of would because you don't. I think part of you doesn't expect to be in that area. Like, if I stumbled upon a murder scene and they were investigating, I'd probably stop and look. Just because it's, not every day you stumble upon a murder scene. Like, when I lived in Alaska, I was driving away and they had I think it was the police searching the water for a victim of Israel Keys. And so we kind of like slowly drove by it so I could like kind of glance at it. Because, hey, it's not every day you stumble upon a major crime scene for that matter. But anyways, enough with the drag on. Moving on. McCullough couldn't think of anything else to do but grab a sheet of brown wrapping paper and drape it over the woman until other investigators arrived. Which is what I would do. Moments later, detectives from the crime scene unit secured the scene and began collecting photographs, fingerprints, hairs, fluids, and anything else that might offer up a sign of her killer. They also located the woman's underwear about 50 yards away from the scene, and a jean jacket lying next to the body helped confirm her identity. Inside was an expensive wallet with passes to fancy nightclubs and a learner's permit. It belonged to Jennifer Levin. And now we're going to take a quick moment to acknowledge our sponsor, which is NordVPN. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you actually felt safe online? Seriously. Because let's be real, these days, between data breaches, shady public Wi-Fi, and apps that track your every move, being online without protection is like leaving your front door wide open. And that's where NordVPN comes in. With just one click, NordVPN creates a secure, encrypted tunnel between your device and the internet. Your IP address, hidden. Your data, locked up tighter than Fort Knox. Whether you're streaming, shopping, or just scrolling TikTok in an airport lounge, NordVPN keeps your digital life private. And here's the cool part. NordVPN has thousands of servers in over 60 countries, which means you can virtually hop around the world to access content that's not available in your region. Want to catch the show that's only streaming in the UK? No problem. Want to avoid bandwidth throttling from your ISP while gaming or streaming? Done. Right now, NordVPN is offering a killer deal exclusively for our listeners. You can get up to 76% off a 2-year plan, plus a $50 Amazon gift card as a thank you for signing up. All you gotta do is use the link in our description. So do what I did. Take back your privacy, protect your data, and browse without limits. NordVPN, the fastest, safest, easiest way to secure your internet. And now back to our episode. As the crowd grew, watching detectives comb the scene for clues, one familiar face stood amongst the onlookers. A jogger, who we'll call Barbara, and her friend passed the group and stopped to see what the commotion was about. Robert turned to a young man no older than 20 and asked what was going on. He said he didn't know, but the police looked like they found a body. Barbara couldn't help but find the young man strange. His face was covered in scratch marks. When she asked him if he'd gotten any closer to see who it was, he said he had. He was worried the police would shoo him away. Barbara and her friend continued strolling on, but her friend was also so alarmed. She turned to Barbara and said, "Did you see the scratches on that guy's face? He looked like he'd been attacked by a machine." Eventually, the police asked the onlookers to clear the area, including the young man, who, unbeknownst to them, happened to be their number one suspect, Robert Chambers. Of course it was. Which, again, I find it so strange when somebody kills someone, which I'm assuming he did, that they go to the scene of the crime, or they involve themselves in the crime. I mean, I would try to make myself look not guilty. I don't know, I just think it's the opposite. It can also be like, okay, I'm not obviously a professional, but what I've heard, it can be like a psychological obsession for sure. Just need to keep feeling that high that they get when you killed them originally. So he'd been lurking in the shadows for hours, waiting to see how the scene unfolded. Finally, Robert went back to his apartment to clean up his face and go to sleep. But it didn't take long for police to catch up with him. Police quickly learned that the last place Jennifer had been spotted, mere hours before her attack, was Dorian's Red Hand. And the person she'd been seen leaving with was none other than Robert Chambers. So he's their first stop on the suspect tour. And when police arrived at Chambers' mother's apartment when he was still living there was one thing they couldn't help but notice: those horrible scratch marks all over his face. When police asked how he got them, he said it was from his cat. He was playing with it, tossing it up in the air and catching it, and got scared and attacked him on the way down. Already, police were finding the story a bit unlikely, even more so when they learned that the family cat had been declawed. But at this point, they were willing to let it go. They asked Robert if he knew Jennifer Levin. He said yes, he did. Then police asked if he'd be willing to come down to the police station for further questioning. Well, strangely enough, Robert happily agreed. He's like, I'll come down with you. After reading Robert his rights down at the precinct, a detective, Mickey McKenna, began the interrogation. He asked Robert more about his relationship with Jennifer. Robert admitted they had sex earlier in the summer, and yes, he'd seen her at Dorian's the night before, but they hadn't spent much time together last night, and he certainly didn't leave with Jennifer. He claimed Jennifer had told him she was going across the street to a Korean deli to buy some cigarettes, and then was maybe going to meet up with an old fling. Meanwhile, Robert said he went to a donut shop on 86 in Lexington, and then went home and watched The Price is Right. It's around now that police noticed not only did Robert have scratches on his face, but his hands were totally cut up too. When they asked him how that happened, he said he was doing some work on a neighbor's apartment with a sander. The tool got away from him and ended up destroying his hands. Man, some bad luck. First the cat attacks his face, now the sander F's up his hands. Oh, I know, I was the last to see her, but I actually wasn't. She went and met up with another fling. Oh, I know I have scratches, but that was a sander. Oh, I know, but that was my cat. It's like so many people don't get attorneys or lawyers. I know it's kind of crazy to me how many people, I guess I would say it's a lot more talked about now though, but I don't know how much had this kid already gotten away with. I mean, look at what they were already getting away with. So obviously, the detective is pretty sure this guy is lying to him. But Robert didn't seem even the least bit nervous, So McKenna is worried that even if Robert did kill Jennifer, he's never going to get confession out of this guy. He's going to be a tough nut to crack. By 7 o'clock, Robert had been at the station for 4 hours, and the entire time, he'd stuck to his original story. Police knew it was time to apply more pressure. which is why they brought in one of their hardest detectives, Mike Sheehan. At around 8 p.m., Mike Sheehan dropped his files down on the table in front of Robert, pulled the chair back, took a seat across from him. His first question was, "How'd you get the scratches?" When Robert stuck to his guns on the cat story, Sheehan scoffed and asked, "What kind of cat do you have? Mountain lion?" Now Robert realizes he's in trouble. This is the first detective to come in and kind of call his bluff, and when Robert also insisted that, no, I left the bar alone, I promise, Sheehan called his bluff again. He said, "Some of Jennifer's friends saw you guys leave the bar together," and he explained that. And here's where Robert started to crack a bit. He changed his tune, claiming, "Okay, yeah, I did leave the bar with her." And after a little more pressure from detectives on those scratch marks, Robert finally gave in. He said, "Okay, yeah, those scratch marks, they're also from Jennifer." And that's when Robert's entire narrative shifted. So, here's his new story, or his second story. After the bar closed that night, he and Jennifer walked towards 86th Street. Then they decided to take a stroll through Central Park. He claimed they took a seat on a park bench, where Robert broke things off with Jennifer. Said he didn't want to see her anymore. And that's when Jennifer started scratching up his face. He said he got up to leave, but Jennifer asked him to stay and continue the conversation. Then he insisted Jennifer grabbed him from behind and attacked him. Then she tied his hands up with her underwear, tackled him to the ground, sat on his chest, and began trying to sexually assault him. Now I want to pause just to remind you that Robert is 6'5" and about 200 and something pounds. Jennifer is more than a foot shorter than him at 5'1" and only 110 pounds. Okay, I'm not saying it's not a believable story. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. I'm just saying keep all this in mind as you're listening. Because Robert goes on to say that Jennifer was assaulting him so badly that he had to retaliate in self-defense, that it took all of his strength, but he finally worked an arm free and grabbed her around the neck. He said he only had his hand around her throat for a second before tossing her off him, but after a few seconds of her not breathing, he realized he'd killed her. So Robert Chambers had just admitted to killing Jennifer Levin in self-defense. However, detectives knew there had to be more to the story. You don't just accidentally strangle someone to death. That's hard. In order to cut off someone's air supply, you have to apply pressure for longer than just a few forgotten seconds like he claimed. Still, he did confess, which is why they had enough to arrest Robert Chambers. At 2 a.m., he's taken on the walk, which is kind of like a police courtesy to the press where they get to snap a few photos of the accused before they're booked and thrown behind bars. And once the media saw what the handsome Robert Chambers from the Upper East Side actually looked like, the preppy killer was born, gracing the front page of tabloids for weeks, each day offering a juicier piece of information than the last. The day after Robert's arrest, his family had already hired one of the most ruthless defense attorneys in the city. His name was Jack Littman. Littman was notorious for doing whatever was necessary to prove a client's innocence, and he often got their sentences reduced or just completely squashed. For example, he'd recently represented a 17-year-old boy who'd been charged with beating his girlfriend to death with a rock. But instead, the attorney convinced the jury that the boy had pushed the girl off of him, she slipped and fell, and hit her head on the rock. That the whole thing was just an accident, and he convinced them that. So Littman knew what it took to make a male defendant look like a powerless victim. And Robert Chambers' case was no different. Littman's other specialty was leaving no stones unturned. With him representing Robert, it was clear that any incriminating detail from Jennifer's past might be used against her in order to back Robert's claims. Ultimately, the facts would have to speak for themselves, and the autopsy proved that some of what Robert said in his confession appeared to be true. There was no semen found in or on Jennifer's body, which led the pathologist to believe Robert hadn't raped her after all. There were, however, other details that were inconsistent with this story. After analyzing Jennifer's face, the pathologist found hemorrhaging on the side of her head, suggesting she was repeatedly punched in the face before she died. So the cause of death didn't appear to be solely strangulation, but also aggravated assault. Littman didn't seem to think these findings would be a problem, though. At Robert's arraignment, they pled not guilty. Littman argued that this wasn't any ordinary self-defense case, but instead, Robert had defended himself in reaction to a violent sex crime. But a prosecutor brought up the autopsy in that first court appearance. They claimed there was not just reports of hemorrhaging and bruising, but also bite marks all over Jennifer's body. They argued she was the one who'd been under attack that night. It was clear to the judge at this point this was not going to be an open and shut case. So the judge ordered that Robert be sent back to jail pending a grand jury hearing. Meanwhile, headlines reading, "Jenny killed in wild sex, and sex got rough," monopolized the tabloids, regardless of whether the statements had any truth to them or not. And with those papers still hot off the press, Robert was getting transferred from his tiny courthouse jail to a cell on Rikers Island, which had a reputation for being one of the most dangerous prisons in the United States. So many of the people who believed Robert was innocent fought for his release, hoping to gain his freedom before something went terribly wrong, which is why at the grand jury hearing, those who knew Robert testified emphatically on the behalf of his character. They said things like, "He's generous, he's considerate, he doesn't anger easily." Robert was portrayed as this reserved Upper East Sider, former altar boy who could do no wrong. But the prosecutor, Linda Fairstein, knew the truth. Robert's past was littered with petty offenses from burglary to credit card fraud. He had problems with drugs and alcohol abuse. Still, the defense painted Jennifer as promiscuous, someone who dated around, who dabbled in violent sexual fantasies. A pill that for anyone who knew Jennifer was impossible to swallow. But it didn't stop Robert from being indicted on murder charges. Yet Robert wouldn't have to spend that time back at Rikers. He was released on bond, where for the next 2 years he lived an ordinary life as the trial came together. And guess who paid his bail money? The owner of Dorian's Red Hand, Jack Dorian, whose son Michael happened to be a good friend of Robert's. In the meantime, Robert's just out and about in New York City, shopping at Tiffany's, going to work, dating new women. The preppy killer was just out there on the loose. But come the fall of 1987, Littman was working hard, putting together the best defense he possibly could for his client Robert. And he focused on getting on one crucial piece of evidence he believed could help with the case. So, in October 1987, Littman sent a list to Fairstein, included a bunch of things he claimed he needed to adequately build his defense. And the biggest item on the list, Jennifer's private diary. Littman had heard from Robert himself that it contained vivid descriptions of Jennifer's sexual encounters. Allegedly, it also contained a list of guys that she had dated in the past. And to Littman, that he equated to other men he could call upon as character witnesses against Jennifer, just proving that she had this sex diary, and of course she tried to sexually assault my client. Many felt it could be a critical tool in proving that Robert's account was true. But Fairstein insisted that the diary was nothing more than an apartment book. There was nothing regarding Jennifer's sexual encounters or anything incriminating against the 18-year-old in that diary. In fact, the diary had been discounted as evidence and handed back over to Jennifer's father for safekeeping. If Littman wanted it, he'd have to subpoena it now from Mr. Levin. And if he did, Fairstein knew it would make Littman look like a chauvinist monster asking for a victim's diary, hoping to prove she was sexually active, and therefore must have been accountable for her own death. It would have been a lot easier just to get it from the prosecutor. But Littman didn't care. He subpoenaed the diary from the family, which made its way up to the judge handling the case. But the judge ruled there was nothing in those pages that was relevant to the defendant's case. Littman's best shot at proving his hostile narrative against Jennifer was shot down. The one piece of evidence he thought he could prove Jennifer's promiscuous reputation simply didn't exist. The defense was falling apart before the trial had even started. Still, around the same time, jury selection began for Robert's case, because this story had been one of the hottest gossip pieces in recent history, it was near impossible to find people who didn't have opinions about it before appearing in court. 3 months of jury selection went by. The attorneys passed on hundreds of potential jurors. Finally, by January 4th, 1988, the trial was ready to proceed. Fairstein argued that in more than 8,000 cases of sexual assault she'd seen over the last decade, this was the first time she'd seen a male claim to be sexually attacked by a female. Not to say it was impossible, but Fairstein kept pointing back to the size differences. A 200-pound Robert versus a 110-pound Jennifer. That's what I was trying to say. She shows the jury photos that prove Jennifer had been quickly strangled in self-defense. She'd been brutally beaten and dragged across the park. She also argued there hadn't been any sex that evening like Robert claimed, but there was a lot of violence caused by him. Littman's defense was much weaker. He argued that the police could have mishandled her remains and caused the bruising on her face after they recovered her body. Littman called on very few witnesses to back his statements, and then he leaned heavily on the idea that, quote, the prosecution needed to prove its case beyond reasonable doubt before Robert could be convicted. He claimed ultimately there wasn't enough proof to say one way or another whether Robert was guilty. In a way, Littman was right. DNA evidence at the time was in its infancy. Fairstein had tested the saliva found on Jennifer's jean jacket, but the judge didn't think the results held up in court. One other sexist detail Fairstein pointed out, that Jennifer's use of diet pills was able to be brought up and used against her in testimony. But Robert's history of cocaine wasn't admissible in court. By March, the only thing left to do was offer their closing statements and let the jury deliberate. They left the box on March 17th. 8 days later, the jury still hadn't come to a decision, but they weren't just disagreeing. The members of the jury had been physically fighting while trying to come to a verdict. By day 9, there was still no decision made. It had been the longest deliberation in New York history. Since they were leaning towards a hung jury, Littman and Fairstein decided to hammer out a plea deal for Robert. On March 25th, 1988, Robert and his counsel accepted the deal, pleading guilty to first-degree manslaughter. Robert was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison. Mere weeks after Robert received his sentencing, one of the most incriminating pieces of evidence against him surfaced. It was a videotape of Robert at a party back around October 1987, right before the trial had begun. Robert was surrounded by a bunch of women in lingerie, and he was playing with a doll. On the tape, he strangled the doll, then popped off its head before saying to the camera, "Oops, I think I killed it." Many felt this was Robert's strange way of admitting his intentions to kill Jennifer, but at that point, the decision regarding his fate had already been made. Robert ended up spending the full 15 years in prison. A little over 4 of those years were spent in solitary confinement because Robert had committed over 30 offenses during his sentencing, many of them drug-related. In 1994, when he went in for his parole hearing, he told the board, "I guess I could give you the party line and say I learned my lesson. I'll never do this again, but that's not how I feel at this moment, because I have a lot of conflicting emotions." Levin's family later sued Robert for $25 million in punitive damages for smearing their daughter's reputation. Robert didn't fight this. He was, however, released on February 14th, 2003. But about a year later, he found himself back behind bars, this time on drug charges. He was in and out of jail for several years. Then in 2008, he pleaded guilty to selling drugs out of his New York apartment. He was serving 19 years behind bars for that crime, 4 more than he was sentenced to for killing Jennifer. Now, to me, that makes no sense, but listen, Robert was eventually released from prison in 2023, and that is the case of Jennifer Levin and the preppy killer. So one, horrible for Jennifer's family. 2, I don't feel bad for I don't want to say it. I don't know the best way to explain it, but it seems like Robert's mom worked so hard to try to give him a good life, and then he goes and kills someone and just screws it all up and just selling drugs the rest of his life. After she worked so hard for that too, it's just, the whole thing sucks. I think we can definitely spend today thinking about Jennifer and her family, because she really was not only victimized awfully in this crime, but then also dragged through the mud at trial and in the tabloids before getting to trial. And it's disgusting. Well, that's our case for this Murder Monday. We'll see you in the next episode. Of course, give us a thumbs up if you like our video. Hit the subscribe button down below. Hit the bell notification button to be notified of all future episodes. And of course, if you want to support the channel, you can scan the QR code that's right there, or just go to buymeacoffee.com/TCNS. As always, thank you so much for watching and listening. We will see you next time.